In the final hours of the Third Reich, as Soviet artillery thundered ever closer to Berlin, and the walls of the Führer bunker shook under the weight of inevitable defeat, Adolf Hitler sat surrounded by maps that no longer mattered. Cities he once commanded were gone. Armies he claimed were loyal had vanished. Allies had betrayed him or surrendered. Yet what haunted him most in those dark underground rooms was not merely military collapse. It was a fear far deeper, older, and more corrosive. A fear he never publicly admitted, but one that shaped his rise, his crimes, and his catastrophic end. From the earliest days of his political life, Hitler cultivated the image of absolute certainty. He presented himself as a man of destiny, chosen by history to restore Germany's honor after the humiliation of World War I. In public, doubt did not exist. Weakness was a sin, compromise was treason, but behind the theatrical speeches and rigid ideology lay a profound terror, the fear of losing control, and with it, the fear of being exposed as ordinary, fallible, and ultimately powerless. This fear was born long before he seized power. As a failed artist in Vienna before the First World War, Hitler experienced rejection repeatedly. His applications to the Academy of Fine Arts were denied. He lived in poverty, drifting between shelters, watching others succeed where he had failed. These years planted a deep psychological wound. He began to see the world not as a place of shared humanity, but as a brutal arena where only domination prevented humiliation. From that moment on, weakness became his greatest enemy, especially his own. The defeat of Germany in 1918 intensified this fear. Hitler embraced the stab-in-the-back myth, convincing himself that Germany had not lost on the battlefield, but had been betrayed from within. This belief was not simply political propaganda, it was psychological self-defense. Accepting military defeat would mean accepting reality. Blaming internal enemies allowed Hitler to preserve the illusion of strength and control. His fear of truth hardened into ideology. As he rose through the Nazi Party in the 1920s, this fear evolved into obsession. Hitler demanded absolute loyalty, not because it was efficient, but because dissent terrified him. Anyone who questioned him threatened to expose uncertainty beneath the carefully constructed myth. Rivals within the party were eliminated. Former allies were purged. By the time he became chancellor in 1933, the system he built revolved entirely around one man's need to dominate reality itself. Once in power, Hitler's fear found its most dangerous expression in total control of society. Independent courts were dismantled. Free media was destroyed. Education was reshaped to serve ideology rather than truth. History itself was rewritten. These were not merely tools of dictatorship, they were shields against the fear that facts might contradict belief. Truth was dangerous. Complexity was dangerous. Only obedience felt safe. Nowhere was this fear more catastrophic than in his racial ideology. Hitler was haunted by the idea of decline, of contamination, decay, and loss of purity. His obsession with racial hierarchy was driven by a terror of degeneration, a belief that civilization itself could collapse if inferior elements were allowed to exist. This fear did not remain abstract. It became policy, law, and eventually genocide. Step by step, dehumanization turned into mass murder. Fear turned into industrialized death. As the Second World War began, Hitler's fear of losing control intensified. Early military successes reinforced his belief in destiny, convincing him that intuition mattered more than strategy. Generals who disagreed were dismissed or ignored. Each victory deepened his dependence on absolute authority. Each setback increased his paranoia. When the invasion of the Soviet Union stalled and the tide of war shifted, Hitler could not accept reality. Retreat was forbidden, withdrawal was weakness. Entire armies were sacrificed to preserve the illusion of command. By 1943 and 1944, Germany was collapsing under relentless Allied pressure. Cities burned, millions died. Yet Hitler retreated further into denial. He surrounded himself with yes-men and punished messengers of bad news. The more the world contradicted him, the more rigid he became. His greatest fear was no longer external enemies. It was the truth that his vision had failed. In the final months, his paranoia reached its peak. He accused his own people of betrayal, declaring that Germany deserved destruction for failing him. In this twisted logic, his fear revealed itself completely. If he could not control history, then history itself must be punished. Loyalty was demanded, even as defeat became absolute. The lives of civilians meant nothing compared to preserving the myth of infallibility. In April 1945, trapped beneath the ruins of Berlin, Hitler faced the reality he had spent his life avoiding. There was no destiny, no final victory, no control. The fear he had denied, fear of failure, fear of exposure, fear of being ordinary, stood before him without illusion. His suicide was not an act of courage, but the final escape from truth. The consequences of this fear reshaped the world. Tens of millions were dead. Europe lay in ruins. Entire cultures were scarred by trauma that still echoes today. Hitler's greatest fear did not protect him. It destroyed everything around him. By refusing to confront reality, he unleashed unimaginable suffering.
History remembers Adolf Hitler as a symbol of evil, but beneath the ideology and terror lies a universal warning. When fear replaces humility, when power silences truth, and when leaders mistake control for strength, destruction follows. The greatest danger is not fear itself, but the refusal to admit it. And when fear is denied, it does not disappear. It multiplies, consumes, and ultimately leaves nothing but silence. From the moment Adolf Hitler stepped onto the political stage, his public persona was built on the illusion of absolute certainty. He spoke with conviction, promised destiny, and projected an image of unwavering strength. To millions, he appeared fearless. Yet beneath that carefully constructed exterior lived a man profoundly terrified of losing control and being exposed as weak, insignificant, and ordinary. This unspoken fear was not a minor personality flaw. It was the central force that shaped his worldview, his leadership, and the destruction he unleashed upon Germany and the world. Hitler's fear of exposure can be traced back to his earliest failures. As a young man in Vienna, he dreamed of becoming an artist, imagining a life of recognition and respect. Instead, he was rejected repeatedly by the Academy of Fine Arts. These rejections struck deeper than professional disappointment. They shattered his sense of identity. In those years of poverty and isolation, he learned what it meant to feel invisible, powerless, and dismissed. Rather than accepting limitation, he developed a defensive hatred of weakness itself. Failure became something to be erased, denied, or blamed on others. This psychological wound never healed, it hardened. The First World War gave Hitler something he desperately needed: structure, purpose, and the illusion of belonging. Yet Germany's defeat in 1918 reopened the same wound on a national scale. For Hitler, surrender was not merely political loss, it was personal humiliation. Accepting defeat would mean confronting reality and acknowledging limits. He could not do that. Instead, he embraced conspiracy and betrayal as explanations. By blaming internal enemies, he shielded himself from the unbearable idea that Germany, and by extension he himself, had failed. This was not just propaganda, it was psychological survival. As Hitler entered politics, his fear transformed into obsession with control. He could not tolerate ambiguity, debate, or contradiction. Every challenge felt like a threat to his identity. This is why his speeches were not discussions but declarations. He did not persuade through logic, he overwhelmed through certainty. The louder and more absolute his claims,
the more effectively they drowned out his inner doubt. Control over others became a substitute for control over himself. Once he rose within the Nazi Party, this fear dictated how he treated rivals. Hitler did not simply outmaneuver opponents, he destroyed them. Loyalty was demanded not as cooperation but as submission. Anyone who disagreed, even privately, risked becoming an enemy. The purges within the party, especially the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, were driven by more than political calculation. They were acts of psychological defense. By eliminating rivals, Hitler eliminated mirrors that might reflect his vulnerability. After becoming chancellor in 1933, Hitler reshaped Germany into a state designed to protect him from exposure. Independent institutions were dismantled because independence meant unpredictability. A free press was silenced because truth could not be controlled. Courts were subordinated because law imposed limits. Education was weaponized because independent thinking was dangerous. Every system was bent toward reinforcing a single narrative. The Führer was infallible. The more absolute the control, the safer Hitler felt. This fear of weakness also explains his fixation on strength as a moral value. In Hitler's worldview, strength equaled virtue, and weakness equaled corruption. Compassion was contemptible. Doubt was betrayal. This mindset justified brutality while disguising insecurity as righteousness. By projecting all weakness onto others, Hitler could deny it within himself. Those labeled degenerate or inferior became living symbols of everything he feared becoming. As his power expanded, so did his isolation. True control requires trust, but Hitler could not trust. He surrounded himself with subordinates who echoed his beliefs rather than challenged them. Generals, ministers, and advisors learned quickly that disagreement led to dismissal or worse. This environment protected Hitler from criticism, but cut him off from reality. His fear of being contradicted gradually blinded him to facts. During the early successes of World War II, Hitler's fear seemed conquered. Rapid victories reinforced his belief that intuition and willpower were superior to strategy and expertise. He began to override military professionals, convinced that his personal judgment was flawless. Yet this confidence was fragile. Each success increased the cost of failure. Admitting error now meant admitting that the myth was false, and Hitler could not survive that exposure. When the war turned against Germany, his fear intensified into denial. Retreat was forbidden because retreat symbolized weakness. Entire armies were ordered to hold impossible positions, not for strategic reasons, but to preserve the image of control. Soldiers died not because defeat was unavoidable, but because admitting reality was unthinkable. Hitler's fear now consumed the lives of millions. By the final years of the war, his obsession with control had become self-destructive. He no longer trusted the German people, accusing them of betrayal when they could not fulfill his fantasies. In his mind, loyalty mattered more than survival. If the nation could not reflect his image of strength, then it did not deserve to exist. This chilling logic reveals the ultimate consequence of denied fear. It turns inward, destroying even what it once sought to protect. In the Führer bunker, as the Third Reich collapsed, Hitler faced the exposure he had avoided his entire life. There were no cheering crowds, no obedient armies, no grand illusions left. Only reality remained. His suicide was the final act of control, an escape from judgment, accountability, and truth. Even in death, he refused to face his own weakness. Hitler's greatest fear was not defeat by enemies, but confrontation with himself. That fear shaped his ideology, his leadership, and the catastrophe he created. It stands as a warning carved into history. When leaders build power on denial, when control replaces honesty, and when fear is hidden behind certainty, the result is not strength but ruin. The refusal to admit weakness does not eliminate it. It magnifies it, until it destroys everything in its path. From the earliest formation of his worldview, Adolf Hitler's ideology was not born from confidence, but from fear. It was fear that hardened into belief, insecurity that transformed into doctrine, and personal fragility that demanded absolute obedience from an entire nation. His intolerance of dissent was not simply a political tactic, it was a psychological necessity. Any opposing voice threatened to crack the rigid structure he built to protect himself from doubt, and doubt, to Hitler, was intolerable. Hitler did not develop his ideology through open inquiry or intellectual debate. He constructed it as a closed system, sealed against contradiction. This was deliberate. An ideology that allows questioning eventually exposes weakness. Hitler feared that exposure above all else. By defining his beliefs as absolute truth, he eliminated the need to defend them rationally. Disagreement could then be dismissed not as an alternative view, but as treason, corruption, or subversion. In this way, fear became the foundation of belief. Central to this ideology was the rejection of pluralism. Diversity of thought implied uncertainty, and uncertainty imply loss of control. Hitler demanded unity, not because it strengthened Germany intellectually, but because it simplified reality into something he could dominate. A single leader, a single party, a single truth. This was not the structure of a confident man, but of one terrified that complexity would overwhelm him. His hatred of dissent emerged clearly during his rise within the Nazi Party. Hitler did not tolerate internal democracy. Decisions flowed downward, never upward. When party members questioned strategy or ideology, they were removed, silenced, or marginalized. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty mattered more than competence, obedience more than insight. This ensured that Hitler would never have to confront uncomfortable truths. Fear was contained by eliminating those who carried it. Once in power, this intolerance became state policy. Opposition parties were banned not merely to secure authority, but to erase alternative realities. Independent newspapers were shut down because facts could challenge belief. Intellectuals, artists, and academics were forced into exile or silence because creativity thrives on questioning. Hitler's regime did not fear armed rebellion nearly as much as it feared independent thought. Thought could not be controlled as easily as bodies. The creation of the Gestapo and the extensive surveillance state reflected this fear-driven ideology. Hitler needed to know not only what people did, but what they thought. Private dissent was as dangerous as public resistance. A joke, a doubt, a whispered criticism, any of these could fracture the illusion of unanimous belief. By criminalizing thought itself, the regime attempted to suffocate fear at its source. This intolerance extended into Hitler's military leadership. Generals were expected to obey without question, even when orders defied logic or reality. Strategic debate, once a corner's tone of military planning, was replaced by blind loyalty. Hitler equated disagreement with disloyalty, and disloyalty with betrayal. His fear of being challenged outweighed concern for victory. As a result, sound military advice was ignored, and catastrophic decisions followed. The invasion of the Soviet Union revealed this pattern clearly. When generals warned of logistical impossibilities and the dangers of a prolonged campaign, Hitler dismissed them. He believed that willpower and ideological conviction could overcome material reality. Admitting the limits of ideology would mean admitting vulnerability. So he doubled down, silencing dissent rather than addressing reality. The consequences were devastating. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler's intolerance of dissent became more extreme. Reality itself became the enemy. Reports of defeat were softened, delayed, or falsified to avoid his rage. Officers learned to tell him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to know. This environment of fear insulated Hitler from truth while accelerating disaster. His ideology demanded obedience, but obedience ensured ignorance. On the civilian front, dissent was crushed with equal ruthlessness. Resistance movements Even symbolic ones were met with disproportionate violence. The regime understood that dissent spreads not through strength, but through example. One act of defiance could inspire others. Hitler feared that chain reaction. Terror became the solution. By making the cost of dissent unbearable, he hoped to maintain ideological control. Yet this fear-driven intolerance weakened the very system it sought to protect. Without dissent, errors went uncorrected. Without debate, policies stagnated. Without criticism, fantasy replaced planning. Hitler's ideology became increasingly detached from reality, operating in a closed loop where belief fed fear and fear fed belief. The system consumed itself. In the final phase of the war, Hitler's paranoia reached its peak. He accused his own people of treachery, claiming that Germany was being betrayed from within once again. This accusation revealed the deepest truth of his ideology. It could not survive failure. If reality contradicted belief, reality had to be destroyed. Cities were ordered to be demolished, infrastructure sabotaged, civilians sacrificed. The nation existed only as long as it reflected Hitler's certainty. In the bunker, surrounded by silence and ruin, Hitler remained intolerant of dissent to the very end. There was no admission of error, no acceptance of responsibility. Even as everything collapsed, he clung to ideology as a shield against fear. His refusal to listen, to adapt, or to acknowledge reality sealed his fate and magnified the suffering of millions. The lesson is stark. An ideology built on fear cannot tolerate dissent, because dissent reveals fragility. But without dissent, power becomes blind. Hitler's downfall was not caused only by enemies abroad, but by the internal decay of a system that feared truth more than defeat. His life stands as a warning. When leaders silence disagreement to protect their certainty, they do not strengthen their cause, they ensure its destruction. Adolf Hitler's racial obsession did not emerge suddenly as a calculated political strategy. It grew slowly from deep psychological insecurity and a desperate need to explain failure, fear, and loss of control. What began as personal resentment hardened into ideology, and that ideology eventually became a system of mass murder. To understand how genocide became possible, one must understand how Hitler's inner anxieties were projected outward onto entire groups of people, transforming private fear into public catastrophe. Hitler's early life was marked by instability, rejection, and a fragile sense of self-worth. As a young man, he experienced repeated failures that he could not emotionally process. His artistic ambitions collapsed. He lacked formal education, professional success, and social status. These experiences fostered a profound sense of inadequacy. Rather than confronting this insecurity, Hitler externalized it. He began to divide the world into forces of strength and weakness, purity and decay, superiority and inferiority. This binary thinking allowed him to escape self-reflection. If weakness existed, it belonged to others, not to him.
In Vienna, where Hitler spent formative years, anti-Semitic ideas were already present in political and cultural discourse.
Hitler absorbed these ideas, but he did not merely adopt them intellectually. He used them psychologically. Jews, along with other marginalized groups, became symbolic containers for everything he feared. Intellectual superiority he could not match. Adaptability he lacked, and social success he believed was denied to him unfairly. His hatred was not rooted in evidence or experience, but in projection. By attributing his failures to imagined enemies, he preserved his fragile self-image. The trauma of Germany's defeat in World War I intensified this pattern. For Hitler, national humiliation mirrored personal humiliation. The collapse of the German Empire threatened his belief in strength, order, and destiny. Once again, he turned to scapegoating. The idea that Germany had been betrayed by internal enemies allowed him to avoid confronting military defeat. and structural weakness. Jews, socialists, intellectuals, and minorities were labeled as corrosive forces undermining the nation from within. This narrative offered emotional relief. It transformed loss into moral outrage and fear into purpose. As Hitler entered politics, racial ideology became the emotional core of his worldview. He did not argue race as a theory open to debate. He treated it as an absolute truth that explained everything. Economic hardship, cultural change, political opposition, and social complexity were all reduced to racial struggle. This simplification was psychologically comforting. A complex world became manageable once it was reduced to enemies and absolutes. The more insecure Hitler felt, the more extreme his racial beliefs became. Once in power, these beliefs were no longer abstract. They were embedded into law. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and legal protection, institutionalizing exclusion. These measures were not only acts of discrimination, they were acts of psychological reinforcement. Each law confirmed Hitler's narrative that Germany could only be strong if weakness was removed. The state became an extension of his inner fears, enforcing them with bureaucratic precision. The escalation from discrimination to extermination followed a chilling logic rooted in insecurity. Exclusion was not enough. Isolation was not enough. Fear demanded certainty, and certainty demanded elimination. As long as the enemy existed, Hitler's fear remained unresolved. Genocide became, in his distorted mind, the final solution to anxiety itself. By destroying those he blamed for weakness, he believed he could purify the world and silence doubt forever. The Second World War accelerated this process. War intensified Hitler's fear of collapse, betrayal, and loss of control. As military fortunes shifted, his paranoia deepened. He became increasingly convinced that internal enemies were sabotaging his efforts. This belief justified more radical violence. The Holocaust expanded not only because of ideology, but because fear demanded escalation. Each setback made restraint feel dangerous. Brutality became reassurance. The industrialization of murder revealed the full transformation of insecurity into genocide. Death camps were not chaotic explosions of violence. They were organized, methodical systems designed to eliminate human beings with maximum efficiency. This bureaucratic coldness reflected the psychological distance Hitler required. Victims were reduced to numbers because acknowledging their humanity would expose the moral void at the heart of the ideology. Dehumanization was essential. Without it, fear would resurface. Millions suffered unimaginable cruelty as a result. Families were destroyed. Cultures were erased. Entire communities vanished. Yet even as the scale of murder expanded, Hitler's fear did not diminish. It grew. Genocide did not bring security. It created dependence on further violence. The regime became trapped in a cycle where killing was required to sustain belief. The more crimes committed, the more desperately they had to be justified. As defeat approached, Hitler's racial obsession turned inward. He accused even Germans of weakness and betrayal, declaring that those who failed him deserved destruction. This moment exposed the true nature of his ideology. It was never about race alone. It was about fear of inadequacy and the need to dominate reality. Once external enemies were nearly destroyed, the ideology consumed its own creators. In the end, Hitler's racial obsession did not protect him from collapse. It accelerated it. By replacing self-examination with hatred, he blinded himself to reality. By turning insecurity into ideology, he transformed personal fear into global tragedy. The Holocaust stands as the ultimate warning of what happens when leaders project inner weakness onto others and gain the power to act on it. This history reveals a universal truth. Genocide does not begin with monsters. It begins with fear denied and insecurity disguised as certainty. When leaders refuse to confront their own limitations and instead define entire groups as threats, the consequences extend far beyond politics. They reshape humanity itself. Hitler's legacy is not only one of evil, but of warning. Fear unacknowledged does not disappear. It multiplies, seeks enemies, and, when given power, can annihilate the world. As Adolf Hitler's power reached its height, his greatest danger was no longer external enemies, but his growing inability to accept reality. What began as confidence hardened into denial, and denial gradually transformed into catastrophic military decision-making. Hitler did not merely misjudge the battlefield, he rejected facts that contradicted his beliefs. This refusal to face reality became one of the most destructive forces of the Second World War, turning strategic setbacks into humanitarian disasters and condemning millions to needless suffering. In the early years of the war, Hitler's denial was masked by success. The rapid defeat of Poland in 1939 and the stunning collapse of France in 1940 appeared to confirm his belief in destiny and personal genius. These victories reinforced his conviction that intuition mattered more than professional military judgment. Each success weakened his respect for expertise and strengthened his belief that sheer willpower could bend reality. From that moment, denial began to replace analysis. As Hitler became increasingly convinced of his own infallibility, he marginalized experienced generals who warned of risks and limitations. Strategic planning, which depends on honest assessments of strength, supply, terrain, and weather, was dismissed as pessimism. Hitler equated realism with weakness. In his mind, acknowledging limits meant surrendering control. This psychological need to dominate reality would soon collide with the unyielding laws of war. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked the turning point. Hitler believed the campaign would be short and decisive, driven by ideological certainty rather than logistical planning. Warnings about the vastness of Soviet territory, the resilience of the Red Army, and the dangers of winter warfare were ignored. Hitler denied the possibility of failure before the first shot was fired. When resistance proved far stronger than expected, denial deepened rather than dissolved. As German forces stalled outside Moscow, reality demanded adaptation. Retreat, regrouping, and flexible defense could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Hitler refused. He issued orders forbidding withdrawal under any circumstances. Entire divisions were ordered to hold positions they could not defend, not for strategic value, but to preserve the illusion of control. Soldiers froze, starved, and died, because reality was not permitted to exist in Hitler's mind. This pattern repeated itself across the war. At Stalingrad, denial reached its most lethal form. When the German Sixth Army became encircled, military logic demanded breakout or surrender. Hitler rejected both. He insisted that the army hold its ground, promising resupply by air that was never realistically possible. Reports of starvation, disease, and collapse were ignored or softened to protect his illusions. Over 300,000 men were sacrificed, not because defeat was unavoidable, but because admitting it was unthinkable. The human cost of these decisions was immense. Soldiers were reduced to expendable symbols of loyalty rather than human beings. Families received death notices for battles that never needed to be fought to the end. Entire cities were reduced to ruins because Hitler refused to retreat from symbolic ground. Denial transformed the battlefield into a graveyard of ideology. As Allied bombing intensified, Hitler's detachment from reality extended to civilians. He refused to acknowledge the suffering of the German population, dismissing it as a test of endurance. Cities burned, food shortages worsened, and millions were displaced. Yet acknowledging civilian collapse would mean acknowledging strategic failure. Instead of adapting, Hitler blamed betrayal, sabotage, and weakness. Responsibility was shifted outward, never inward. By 1944, the military situation was beyond recovery. Allied forces advanced from the west, the Red Army surged from the east, and Germany's resources were exhausted. Still, Hitler denied the scale of defeat. He imagined phantom armies, fictional reserves, and miraculous counteroffensives. Maps were filled with units that existed only on paper. Orders were issued to formations that had already been destroyed. Reality had become optional. This denial did not merely prolong the war, it magnified its cruelty. As defeat approached, Hitler adopted a scorched earth mentality. He ordered the destruction of German infrastructure, factories, and transportation networks to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. These orders were not militarily necessary. They were expressions of resentment. If reality could not reflect his vision of strength, then reality deserved to be destroyed. The suffering inflicted by these decisions extended beyond soldiers and civilians to prisoners of war and concentration camp victims. As resources dwindled and chaos increased, conditions in camps deteriorated further. Forced marches, starvation, and mass executions intensified. Denial allowed the regime to continue killing even as collapse was inevitable. Reality was no longer denied, it was punished. In the final months, Hitler's denial reached its most extreme form. He refused to acknowledge that the war was lost, even as Soviet forces entered Berlin. He accused generals, civilians, and the entire German nation of betrayal. In his final political testament, he declared that if Germany could not win, it did not deserve to survive. This was the ultimate consequence of denied reality, complete moral collapse. Hitler's refusal to accept reality transformed military defeat into a human catastrophe. Wars are always destructive, but denial turned destruction into annihilation. Every opportunity to save lives was rejected because it required humility. Every chance to end suffering was ignored because it required truth. Millions died not only from enemy fire, but from one man's inability to admit failure. This history offers a stark lesson. Power that rejects reality becomes lethal. Leaders who silence facts and surround themselves with obedience lose the ability to see the world as it is. When denial replaces judgment, decisions become disconnected from consequence, and suffering multiplies unchecked. Hitler's downfall was not merely the result of strategic mistakes, it was the result of a mind that could not tolerate truth. The tragedy of the Second World War reminds us that reality cannot be conquered by will alone. It demands respect, humility, and accountability. When leaders refuse to accept it, they do not bend the world to their vision. They break it, and everyone within it pays the price. Adolf Hitler's life and downfall stand as one of history's clearest warnings about the destructive power of unchecked authority, fueled by fear and ideology. His rise was not inevitable, nor was his collapse sudden. It was the result of a long chain of choices rooted in denial, obsession, and a refusal to recognize human limits. When power is concentrated in one individual who believes himself infallible, the consequences extend far beyond politics. They reshape societies, destroy moral boundaries, and leave scars that endure for generations. Hitler did not seize power through force alone. He exploited fear, resentment, and humiliate. Ion already present in German society after World War I. Economic collapse, national shame, and political instability created a population desperate for certainty. Hitler offered simple answers to complex problems, presenting himself as the embodiment of strength in a world that felt chaotic and weak. This was the first warning sign. When people surrender critical thinking in exchange for emotional reassurance, they place their future in dangerous hands. Once in power, Hitler dismantled the safeguards designed to prevent absolute authority. Independent institutions were weakened or destroyed. Courts lost their autonomy. The press became a tool of propaganda. Opposition was criminalized. Each step was justified as necessary for national survival. But the real effect was the elimination of accountability. Without checks and balances, power no longer served the state. The state served power. Unchecked authority allowed ideology to replace reality. Hitler's worldview was not tested against facts. It was imposed upon them. Evidence that contradicted belief was dismissed as sabotage or treachery. Experts who disagreed were silenced. This created an environment where decisions were based on loyalty rather than truth. In such a system, errors multiply because there is no mechanism to correct them. The leader hears only echoes of his own voice. The human cost of this dynamic was immense. Policies driven by ideology rather than evidence led to persecution, war, and genocide. Entire populations were defined as enemies, not because of actions, but because of identity. Once dehumanization became official policy, cruelty followed naturally. When leaders view people as symbols rather than human beings, suffering becomes abstract and easy to ignore. Violence turns from tragedy into routine. Hitler's unchecked power also corrupted those around him. Many individuals who might otherwise have resisted became complicit, adapting to survive within the system. Fear silenced conscience. Ambition overrode morality. The regime demonstrated how quickly ethical standards can collapse when authority demands obedience and punishes doubt. This is another warning. Tyranny does not rely on one man alone. It spreads through silence, compliance, and rationalization. As the war progressed and reality contradicted Hitler's promises, unchecked power became even more dangerous. Without accountability, failure was never acknowledged. Instead of adapting, the regime doubled down on destruction. Cities were sacrificed, armies were wasted, civilians were abandoned. The inability to admit error transformed defeat into annihilation. Power, once unchecked, could not retreat gracefully. It could only collapse violently. In his final months, Hitler revealed the ultimate consequence of absolute authority divorced from responsibility. He no longer distinguished between the state and himself. Germany existed only as an extension of his will. When that will failed, he condemned the nation along with himself. This was not leadership, it was possession. It showed how unchecked power ultimately consumes even what it claims to protect. The aftermath of Hitler's rule forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths. The Holocaust revealed how ordinary systems, bureaucracy, law, technology, can be transformed into instruments of mass murder when guided by ideology instead of ethics. The war demonstrated how quickly civilization can regress when leaders reject truth and elevate themselves above accountability. These lessons were written in ruins, graves, and survivor testimony. History does not preserve these events merely to recount horror, but to warn future generations. The danger does not lie only in dictators, but in the conditions that allow them to rise. Economic despair, social division, political polarization, and fear can make societies vulnerable to those who promise certainty without responsibility. When citizens trade freedom for reassurance, they may gain neither. Unchecked power also reminds us that ideology, when treated as absolute truth, becomes immune to morality. Once a belief system declares itself beyond question, it justifies any action in its defense. Violence becomes necessary. Dissent becomes evil. Humanity becomes negotiable. Hitler's regime illustrates how easily ideals can be weaponized when there is no mechanism to challenge them. The most enduring warning from Hitler's downfall is not about one man, but about human nature. Fear seeks control, power seeks expansion. Without restraint, both spiral into destruction. Safeguards such as free speech, independent institutions, and moral accountability exist not to weaken leadership, but to protect humanity from its worst impulses. When these safeguards are removed, history shows what follows. Hitler's end was lonely, silent, and meaningless compared to the grand destiny he promised. The world he tried to dominate rejected him. The ideology he enforced collapsed. What remained was devastation and regret. His life proves that power gained through fear ultimately dies in fear, leaving nothing of value behind. The universal lesson is clear. No leader, no ideology, and no nation is above truth. When power is unchecked, when fear replaces humility, and when belief silences conscience, destruction becomes inevitable. History's greatest tragedies begin not with hatred alone, but with the refusal to listen, to question, and to accept limits. Remembering Hitler's downfall is not about dwelling on the past. It is about recognizing warning signs in the present and future. Power must always answer to truth. Authority must remain accountable. And fear must never be allowed to define destiny. When those principles are forgotten, history does not repeat itself exactly, but it echoes with consequences just as devastating.